Hi, my name is Will and I run Greensand Distillery here in Kent, and I get to talk a little bit about sustainability, which is a topic that's really close to my own heart, but it's also part of the ethic of this distillery to use what influence we have to try and change the industry for the better. To that end, there's a handout that goes along with this talk, and it acts as a little bit of a checklist so you can walk through the activities in your own distillery in detail and see where you can make any improvements. I think sustainability from a marketing perspective is incredibly important these days. The twin themes of authenticity and sustainability are absolutely key for us, and I think consumers respond to those more and more and will do more so in the future. That compares with consumers being more and more hypersensitive to being sold to, and consumers are becoming much less tolerant to deception and deceit in marketing messages, and especially when it comes to green initiatives, consumers who respond to sustainability have, I think, probably a zero tolerance to deception in that messaging. So if you're thinking about implementing, or if you do implement green messaging in your marketing communications, make sure that you have a really robust framework below that you can build upon, so it comes across as really credible and not a thin veneer on top of everything else you're doing. So what I'd like to do is just walk through how we define sustainability in our business, then touch on a few of the challenges in specific areas that we've had and what we've done to mitigate those, and then just finish with a few thoughts on how we talk to our customers about sustainability. And even if sustainability isn't core to your business right now, you can still talk to your customers about sustainability and take them on a journey with you. So Greensand Ridge Distillery, 5 years on from founding, is being recognised now for the work we do in sustainability. I built this business from the ground up as a sustainable business, and it means that we've now won a few awards, and we've won those awards in fairness, not for the magnitude of the impact we have, because we are still a relatively small distillery, but for the breadth of work we do. So absolutely everything we do in this distillery, we put through a filter of sustainability, and if we can't do it sustainably, we won't do it. Now, I'm not dogmatic. I don't believe that that's the approach every distillery will take, but do feature green thinking and sustainability in your decision making where you can. So we think about sustainability in three different ways, and this industry doesn't tend to be super corporate, and we're certainly not, but I do think if you're thinking about sustainability and green issues, it really helps as a team to kind of set out a mission statement for what you want to achieve. It puts a framework in place, and it allows you to kind of think quite clearly about how to behave and how to react to certain decisions that come your way. We think about it in three ways. We want to have the smallest possible footprint on the lands, the smallest possible environmental footprint. We want to have a positive impact on our community, and we do that by taking exclusively surplus produce or byproduct to use as fermentables for our distilled spirits. And we want to be an agent of change in the industry and with consumers. And for me, that's a really important part of green thinking, because there are things that we as a distillery and we as an industry do which, on the face of it, if you assess the magnitude of those things against the net carbon intensity of a business like this, it has almost no impact. It really doesn't shift the dial at all. But it has really high consumer engagement. So an example I like to think about maybe is something like refill schemes at distilleries. You know, if you're a business doing tens or hundreds of thousands of cases a year, and you know you have handfuls of customers coming up and refilling the bottles at the distillery, it really has negligible impact on your carbon footprint. But it has a really, really high impact on consumer engagement. And so I think it's a really valuable thing to consider in your total sustainability drive, encouraging consumers to think greener in their purchasing decisions, as well as you're mitigating your actual environmental footprint. That doesn't excuse, of course, being careful about the language we use when we're communicating with consumers, but I'll come back to that in a little while. Now, sustainability, there is an inherent difficulty in implementing green thinking in a business because there tends to be, I think, an inverse relationship between the magnitude of impact and the ease of implementation. So this is a little graphic that kind of roughly shows the magnitude of impact across different factors, from things like energy and distribution and bottles and stuff in this distillery. And you can see that, I mean, this is just a rough diagram, but it's based upon the accounting and auditing we do for our carbon neutral assessment. You can see that things like energy use, which is a very difficult thing to change in an industry, going from gas to electricity, for example, is not simple, but it has one of the biggest impacts on our environmental footprint. And that compares with things that are easiest but also sexiest. Things like changing from plastic to paper straws. That has a really high consumer engagement and is quite a sexy thing to talk about and an interesting thing to talk about, but has really negligible impact on the environmental footprint of a distillery. So I think it's absolutely valid to chip away at those low-hanging fruits, the kind of sexy, easy thing to implement things, but you have to be thinking about these big things, the big questions. How do we take the carbon out of our distribution chains, out of our energy use, out of our product, all these kind of things. So thinking about those things in a little bit more detail. The energy we use in a distillery, well, our goal is to use 100% renewable power and recover all the energy that would otherwise be wasted. And we're doing pretty well on that. We use grid electricity. We choose to use a green supplier, and I think that's a valid approach. The grid is pretty good at installing green electricity, and we consider we're sponsoring the installation of green capacity in the grid. There is one clear thing, and that is we have to divest as an industry and as an economy from carbon sources of fuel, so oil and gas and LPG. We can't continue to build as an industry new distilleries relying on these sources of energy. They're desirable sources because they're incredibly energy dense and they are cheap. But I just think ethically it's the wrong thing to do to continue to use these sources of energy within distilleries. So what can we do? Well, electricity, I've already mentioned, is a valid approach as long as you're using a green supply. Either direct energy heating in your stills, or if you're a larger distillery, that means gas generators, electric gas steam generators. Biomass, in this part of the world, pellets, wood chips. In other parts of the world, maybe bagasse, or biodiesel or bio-LPG. Biodiesel is being used in a few distilleries in the UK, and bio-LPG is a very new technology in Europe, but will be becoming much more prevalent in the years to come. And I think energy recovery is really important. It used to be the preserve of the largest distilleries because the off-the-shelf energy recovery systems are very expensive. But it needn't be, so we've built our own energy recovery system. It saves us about 15% of our distillations in terms of energy that we use. So that's mainly the stillage coming out of the still, going into a heat store, and we can recover all that energy, but it's also the heat energy in our cooling water as well, and I'll come back to that. The raw materials in our spirits, in terms of growing them, the water intensity, the carbon intensity in terms of producing the alcohol itself is quite high. Now I'm talking mainly to people who'll be using neutral spirit bought in, and so actually your ability to control that is limited. We do make fermented and distilled spirits, and we use exclusively byproduct for those. We do also use neutral spirit, and our end ambition is to use entirely food waste to produce all the neutral spirit we use. We're not quite there yet. So what can you do if you're using neutral spirit? Well, you can assess your providers to choose the most locally grown crops, the locally grown spirits, and the most efficiently produced spirit. Choose to use organic if that's what you want to do, or non-GM. It's really a decision-making framework that you individually have to make. For us, organic doesn't make sense because it would limit the amount of farmers that we're able to work with taking their surplus produce. So that's not something that makes sense for us, but we kind of have a long-term ambition as regards neutral spirit. For me, it's an ethical consideration. What's the opportunity cost of all the agricultural land that is given over to growing crops to make alcohol? And that's food that could be produced for human consumption. So for me, there is an ethical consideration here. If we can shift as an industry to using some of the waste as fermentables that we produce as part of our food consumption, then that's a good thing. Distribution's a very hard one for me in this distillery to crack, because it's one of the things we can't actually control directly. So there is a very fragmented distribution system in all countries. So from when we send out spirits to when it gets to the customer, our stock might have been handed over 2 or 3 times. So, and we have limited control around that. There is no current national and competitive electric-only distributor that we can use at the moment. So what can we do? Well, we use green distribution where we can. Where we can't pay for our distributors to offset their own emissions, we pay for the offset. What I recommend doing is offsetting all the carbon intensity in your distribution, your sales, but also on your website and for customer sales. Give your customers the option of offsetting, of buying a slightly more expensive, and I'm talking pence here, a shipping method to offset the carbon emissions, and your customers will choose that. But it also really overtly demonstrates that you as a business are thinking about this and thinking about ways to mitigate the challenges in your business. Raw materials in terms of the packaging, not the raw materials that go into your spirits, and I'm really thinking about the bottle and the closures. And I think this is one area where there might be a conflict between kind of premium presentation, if you like, and sustainability. The number of bottles I see with huge, great plastic and metal bottle decorations is really not a very sustainable and eco way of thinking, but they have high consumer engagement. Glass is actually a really eco-friendly way to pack and ship spirit, because there's a very, very high recycling rate in this country, and the infrastructure of glass recycling is very, very good. There's another ethical consideration is if, sure, you as a business can send out recyclable materials to your customer, but if they're not going to be recycled, if there's no infrastructure of recycling for that product, and that often applies to things like plastic films, then that's really no better than something that's single use or is just going to be incinerated, which it most likely is. Things like closures, are you using agglomerated cork, which is something that might not break down in the environment? Or are you using natural cork? Are you using sustainably sourced wood for closures? Or are you using a lot of single-use plastics in your, plastic shanks in your corks, or a lot of single-use plastic on your bottles? All those kind of things are really important considerations. We don't use any bleached cardboard, so all the cardboard for our packaging and all that kind of stuff is recycled, and it's unbleached, so it's a natural kind of recycled color, and it signals to our customers that we're maybe thinking about this stuff, but it's also a very low chemical intensity process itself. The only big no-no for me is I have a bit of a difficulty with ceramic bottles. They are effectively single-use, very high energy intensity way to package spirits. Absolutely fantastic for limited editions and those kind of products which are going to be, a smaller batch maybe, but for generic packaging, it is a bit tricky from a sustainability perspective. And recycled glass is great. A lot of people wouldn't accept the color differences in recycled glass, but I think that could be a really interesting story. Water use is a difficult one for a distillery because we undervalue water so much. It's an incredibly cheap resource, and actually we don't pay all the externalities in for our water that we should in terms of chemical production in the environment and taking water out of the environment. So what can we do? Because there isn't really a financial incentive to mitigate it, I think the first thing to do is to value the resource, be in the mindset of valuing water as a resource, and then it creates that incentive to actually mitigate it. So I'm talking mainly water use in terms in the distillery, not in our supply chain, but in the distillery in terms of cooling water. We use a lot of cooling water, as I'm sure everybody does, and we use a lot of salt to soften that cooling water as well. So we've decided that after a lot of investigation, we need to use a closed loop cooling system, so that will mitigate all of the salt use we use, and it will reduce by about 85% the water that we use. A lot of the closed loop cooling systems use large amounts of electricity to actually chill the water, adiabatic chillers or other ways. So we've designed a system where we're currently building a wildlife pond that is going to provide all of the cooling for our distillery, but in an incredibly low energy way. So we'll have 3 heat exchangers. We'll have a first heat exchanger which will preheat the water for the hot water for the distillery, a second one in the body of the water of the lake which will take most of the water out, and then a third in the base where there's about a constant 11 degree environmental temperature, and that will take our cooling water down to below 15 degrees. And we'll do all that for a net pumping energy cost of about 600 watts. So it's incredibly low energy, low intensity, and it actually provides the environment with a aquatic environment for things like newts and dragonflies and all that stuff. So we'll be communicating more about that project as we do it, and we're going to be writing that up as a project in association with the University of Heriot-Watt. I don't expect everyone can do that, but certainly closed loop cooling systems I think are the way forward. If you can do that in a low energy way, then all the better. Chemicals I also think about within this kind of framework of water and salt. We are a zero chemical distillery, so we don't use any caustic or anything like that for cleaning our fermentation vessels or our lines. We rely on steam and heads of distilling. Obviously, if you're going to do that, do it really carefully, because it can be quite dangerous. But we get really good results from our fermentations, and there is no need to use traditional caustic and non-biodegradable chemicals in a distillery. There are ways and means of doing it really well without using all of that. And finally, consumables. I mean, this is something that is really eye-catching. You know, the straws, the bags, boxes, all of the things we ship out from a distillery. We want to be zero plastic, and we want to make sure that anything we send out to consumers is going to be recycled and can be recycled, and ideally is compostable. There's these 2 words, compostable and biodegradable, that we're using kind of interchangeably in consumables, but they're not the same. Compostable means compostable in a commercial composter, so high temperature, high moisture for a long time. Plastics like PLA, which are in reality no better than oil-based plastics. So we really try not to use any of those alongside any oil-based plastics at all. Instead, we're trying to use compostable things which will break down naturally in the environment over a period of weeks. So think about when you're getting bags made. You know, are you using cotton handles on your bags, which are, you know, to grow cotton takes huge amounts of water. And you're effectively using a single-use piece of cotton there, which isn't great. Are you using laminated, kind of very high premium feel bags, laminated with plastics and metals, but it can't be recycled? So we use very obviously kind of basic, to look at them, kind of cardboard packaging that isn't bleached, doesn't have any cotton or high varnish finishes on. And it kind of signals again to customers what kind of brand we are, but we're doing it purposefully because we know that they are in reality single-use items, and they can be recycled. So things like, where is it made, the ability to recycle, is it chlorine bleached, the actual ability to biodegrade, all of these things are really critical thinking when it comes to consumables. And finally, I just want to talk about how we communicate with our customers, and specifically the language of trust. Now there's two aspects to this. One is in a sales environment. There's a book by Michael Maslansky on the language of trust in a sales environment. I'd recommend it to any kind of sales team. It's an interesting read, and what I take from it is telling a story is really important. Telling a story is way better than spinning a status quo, or even worse, spinning a compromise. So if you don't be in the mindset of looking for things in your business that you can brand as sustainable and you can put together a kind of package of green thinking like that. It's much better to communicate to your customers where you want to get to, all of the successes you're having, all of the challenges you're having, and take them on a journey. Report back after a year, celebrate your successes, and communicate your challenges, and you get really good consumer engagement. Your consumers respond as well to that as just a blanket statement of sustainability, and again, it's this storytelling, admitting changes, and using neutral fact-based language to talk about those challenges and your successes. And the other thing I think is not a sales message so much as a responsibility we have as an industry. We have a responsibility to educate our customers about the challenges in distilling and what is sustainable. Distilling can be quite complicated, quite it's got a lot of magic and mystique about it, which is great, but it also is sometimes a barrier for a deep understanding of what is sustainable in this business. And I think we all have a responsibility to be honest with our consumers about what really is sustainable in distilling, because there's a large part of the market which is just going to take on face value what we say, and if it doesn't reflect the reality or an actual true assessment of what is the right thing to do in a distillery, then I think we're doing everybody a disservice and all our peers a disservice. So I hope that was useful. That was a very quick canter through a few of the things we do in this distillery. Have a look at the handout. As part of our work, we want to be really helpful to other distilleries, so if there's anything we can do, please get in touch. And likewise, if there's any thinking that you can share with us that we can benefit from, please, again, get in touch with us. Good luck with your efforts. Cheers.